This is Main Street with Gary Allen. Now, here's Gary.
And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Main Street. My name is Gary Allen. I'll be with you for the next hour. We are on every Tuesday at 2 p.m. You can see my guest already, Mr. Joe Johnson. We'll talk about that gentleman in just a couple of minutes as he's directing things and moving things around.
Trying to figure out which way my finger turns. Okay.
Hey, that's a personal problem, my friend. Just between you and I want to thank a couple of people. My executive producer, Rick Del Vecchio, studio engineer, Andres, who is with us today. I also want to thank Michael and Grant Miller for the opportunity to be on the C News Network. Also, our community sponsors, the Japanese Garden and the Elks Lodges of South Florida. Next week, we have Ron McGill on from Zoo Miami. We're going to talk about some of the stuff coming up there. And there's going to be an event going on at some point in the next few months down there, of which Joe and his lovely wife, Coop, who I was hoping would join us today, but she's busy doing show business stuff.
She's got to earn some money.
Somebody does in that family, that's for sure.
Exactly.
This gentleman, catch him at WLRN weekdays, 5 to 10. I don't know how he does it. 91.3 in Miami. He's here with us today to help celebrate 30 years as the creator, writer, genius behind Beatle Brunch, which originally started out at Magic 102.7, and now it has blossomed into over 200 radio stations all over the bloody place, of which I'm not even going to mention too many. Most of the stations that it's on is in cities where the Beatles played.
Well, quite a few, New York and Philly and Los Angeles, L.A., San Francisco.
A couple of my former places where I lived before rents got to be a point where you can't afford to live there anymore at all. That's for sure. But he was at Magic 102.7 well over 28 years. Yes. He had held numerous positions there. That's where we first met way back when I was doing Waxy. He was over at Magic, along with all the other great people that were there. He is a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, and someone who I cherish his friendship so much so. And he's been kind enough to come on this show. I don't know why, but he's kind enough to come on this show from time to time. He says I have nothing. He's like somebody else I know. Oh, I got an hour. I need to find a part-time job. Anyway, Mr. Joe Johnson joins us, the host and creator of Beatle Brunch, which is not heard in Miami, but you can catch it on brunchradio.com. And if you're looking to add it to your repertoire, for your program director out there, we'll give you some information as the program proceeds forward where you can get a hold of it and put it on your radio station. And by all means, I do. Joe, I've asked you this question before.
Okay.
But with all the groups that are out there, like the Beach Boys and the Rolling Stones and others of that genre and that time period, why the Beatles? I mean, the Beach Boys have just as big of a repertoire and catalog as the Beatles do. Why? What was it? I mean, you loved the Beatles. I know you do. But what was it that drew you and said, I got to put together a show?
Well, it was actually pretty specific. I had just bought a 1992 Mitsubishi Eclipse Turbo. It's a fun little car. First car I ever had that had a CD player, because that was 1992. And I went for a ride. We were taking those crazy family pictures, where everybody sits on a rock and, at Sears, and you pose and with your family and all that. So we were taking that picture. So I had to drive down to Cutler Ridge from Pembroke Pines, and there's about 45 minutes. And I threw a bunch of Beatles CDs on the passenger seat, and they were kind of my co-pilot on the way down and back. And because I had this CD player with all these cool speakers, I'm hearing, singing in the right channel and the guitar and drums in the left channel, as the Beatles often mix their early hits. And so when I got back to work the next day, I asked the program director. The director of programming was Rick Peters, who's still the director of programming at our station in Montgomery, Alabama. And he's fantastic. And I said to him, man, why is it that no station here doesn't have a Beatles show? It's so good. I'd love to do something like that. And he says, well, why don't you put something together? So that was like a Friday. So I came in over the weekend. I used their studio and I just mocked up a show about Sgt. Pepper, because it was 25th anniversary of Sergeant Pepper, and this is the actual show, Gary. This is the DAT
Wow.
tape I recorded the actual show on.
And I know the kids are out there going, what is that he's holding in his hand? Is that a razor? Is that a radio?
No,
What is
it's a cassette deck that got wet and shrunk. Now this is a digital audio tape, and at the time they were, the quality, and you can see this little door opens underneath like a cassette, and the quality is real good. I mean, obviously now you've got CDs and microphones that are much better quality or just as good. So anyway, we did the show. We tested it out. He listened to my demo. He kind of liked it. We made some changes to it, and we put it on Magic that Sunday or we waited until Memorial Weekend. So it would have been a special weekend, and we promoted it for like 2 weeks on the radio. So that's it. It landed there, and then there was no syndication. I didn't have anybody helping me syndicate it for 8 years. So from 1992 to 2000, I just made copies, and I would make a DAT, and then I would from the DAT you could dub 2 reel-to-reels at the same time in the studio. So I would make, and each one took an hour in real time. So I would copy, and we had a few stations that our company owned. Sconix was called the name of the station, based on the 3 guys that owned it. Each that was part of their name, Scott and Scott Nixon or something. So we ended up putting it on the 4 other stations they owned. So we started out, after a couple of weeks on the one, on 5 stations, which was cool. And then I just started reaching out to radio stations, calling program directors. And in that time, if you wanted them to hear the show, I had to overnight them a cassette, because they didn't have a DAT player, and CDs were just now coming into recordable, but they were blank CDs were like 17. I remember they were $17 each. Now you can buy a sleeve of them at Best Buy for like $5,
Yeah.
So if anybody does that anymore, I keep some around here in my studio. But anyway, so yeah, I went from 5 stations, and then I would talk to a program director, email him the show.
By the way, say hello to Princess. Say hello to Princess.
Is that
Princess,
your
my
kitty cat?
That's my cat. Yes. She kind of runs the household, and she once in a while will pop in on a show, which means now she gets a royalty after the show.
Yeah, that's good. I hope it's as much as I'm getting. So
it's funny. You were talking about the DATs and sending out cassettes, which is how we all got jobs in radio, by sending out a cassette.
Sure.
And now there are CDs and stuff like that. But
no, you just email your demo,
and you do your own marketing. There wasn't these marketing companies like there were today, particularly for a news show such as yourself and everything. But it was a hit. I mean, my God, you're in over 200 radio stations now and growing.
Yeah, and we just added the company that syndicates me, Compass Media. They just added in the Monterey Bay area all the way up to San Francisco. There's like 3 stations that roll all the way up to like Santa Cruz, and then up to the Northern California coast. So those either just started or starting this coming weekend, but it's quite a few. I have a list on brunchladio.com. I think all the way on the right is like a connect with us kind of page. And you can see the stations. I don't have every single one listed there, but it's one of those things I'd sit down and do it manually one of these days. But it's quite a few.
Give out the website. Give out the website.
Oh yeah, it is BeatleBrunch.com. But when I was talking with Yoko's attorneys at one time, we decided that brunchladio.com is better. So, but I still have BeatleBrunch.com, but I mostly promote it through brunchladio.com because they were a little nervous about having somebody using the word Beatle in the title of their web domain. I don't blame them. So if somebody said Joe Johnson tire wear or something, I'd be like, hey. So anyway, brunchladio.com, BeatleBrunchClub.com, all these different websites connect there. Go there. Yeah. You can join. If you navigate up, it'll say become a member of the Beatle Brunch Club. I hear every show on demand. We always put bonus tracks. If I'm producing the show and it comes out too long for me to send it, I put that version on the website, and I recut the version for the syndicator, because it has to be like 48 minutes is the total time before the commercials come in. So
now, were you doing Beatle Brunch before Jukebox Saturday Night?
No, I started Jukebox Saturday Night in 1987, I think, and I did it until 2001. What was the new year coming in when they were like Y2K, and then it was everybody was nervous that their can openers wouldn't work and all that stuff. So I did it for like 15 years, and I did stand-up comedy as well at that time and before. So that was what I thought made the show go, because it was so spontaneous. Everything we
Yes.
did with the listener was to answer the phone, come up with some premise. Some of them were just play the song, but a lot of them were, oh yeah, what are you doing on a Saturday night? Did you guys order pizza? Blah blah blah. Who's your wife? Who are your kids? Kind of playing
Yeah.
around with them. And I think that a lot of families listened in the house, and a lot of parties. I would get a call on the request line, and it would be so loud with like people yelling and everything, and I knew they were having a party and didn't invite me. That's why they have them on Saturday. But Jukebox Saturday Night, I loved doing that show. I have my wife's wanting me to throw them away, but I got a great big gigantic box in the garage of pretty much every show, because you would pop the cassette in and you would air check the show, which meant every time you flip the mic on it, the cassette would start recording, and you flip it off.
Well, don't get rid of that stuff. Don't get rid of that stuff.
Well, what I would want to do if I had somebody that could do it or I could do it. It's just time consuming. Lay the whole cassette down into a Pro Tools mix, and where the song cuts off, reattach it, and just reattach all the songs. I mean, I don't know. The show would still, I think, be pretty entertaining. But would you edit out the local stuff or the local contesting, or caller 10 gets a CD, these brand new compact digital discs that are coming out, that kind of thing. There's a lot of local art festival chat and stuff like that going on. It was a local show. So, but I think if I took a 5-hour show and scoped it down to 2 hours, it could run, it could stand out.
I still think if a platform becomes available, somebody should put you back on the air to do that, even if it's just Saturday night. People, nothing pleases people more, and this because you get out amongst the public when you do the cruises and stuff.
Yeah.
Nothing pleases them more than to be part of a radio show.
Right.
They may not call in. It's like when I was a young man and I used to see people dancing in front of television cameras when they'd be doing the man on the street reports and stuff. People love to be part of whatever is going on. And for people to call in, they loved it. Besides, you're a pleasant personality. You've always been a great guy, and people, otherwise Coop wouldn't have never married you anyway. But, I can say that, I'm friends with these people and they're great folks, but you're pleasant. You're wonderful. You're not sarcastic, although you have certainly helped start a number of fights on the air.
Yes. Many.
With what you're doing. You mentioned earlier, you kind of began with the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album.
That was the feature of the first show. Yeah.
Yeah. And I saw the rockumentary, which part of it, little bits and pieces of it. I didn't see it like you did. And I also saw an interview with McCartney, which we're going to get to because you interviewed McCartney and Ringo. We're talking to Joe Johnson here on Main Street. Gary Allen with you, as I am every Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Next week, we have Ron McGill joining us from Zoo Miami. The costumes that they wore, McCartney said there was no plan for that. They just went out someplace and here were these costumes. They got them, and the decor and the background and everything was there, and boom, they really didn't plan it out 100%, unless I misunderstood him.
Well, they didn't plan it out 100%, but McCartney has since said, and even maybe on that special, he said he came across an old picture of his dad. He was in the Jim Mack band, and it was that kind of thing where they were standing around a stand-up bass and a drum, and it was him and the other members of the band, and they were in these matching kind of uniforms. So I think he got the idea, not only for that, but to have it, the band, you had Dr. Hook and the Medicine Show and all these crazy names where it was that plus this. So it was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So I think he kind of got the idea from that. And then what he liked about it was we didn't have to be the Beatles. We didn't have to play She Loves You and all that stuff. We could just play weird stuff because we're that band. We're those guys. We're the Sgt. Pepper's band. So that's what they did. And it was a huge success. I don't think they were expecting it to be as big as it was. And the other thing that they did that was unique is they banded the songs together really tight. So when you listen to Sgt. Pepper, when Lucy in the Sky ends, I guess it's Getting Better or whichever song starts like right away. There's no space. And then they put at the end a little sound for dogs. They put like a high-pitched tone that's not really listenable.
It's not audible. It's not audible
is the word.
Yeah.
It's not audible, but it's in a different tone that's too high. So dogs would like, pay attention at the end of the record. And then they put a little bit of chatter, every other day, did you every happen other day? And they just loop that. So like if you were sitting on the couch and you were too lazy to get up, it would just play. No, they never have seen any other day. Never have seen any other way. Never have seen any other way. And the record would just spin and spin instead of clicking. So they did a lot of cool things like that. I mean, it's hard to imagine that Sgt. Pepper was the first gatefold album. You opened it up like a book. They never had that before. So you had like pictures of the band and that, and then you had on the back, you had all the lyrics, and nobody had ever put their song lyrics on the albums before. And all of the songs were originals to John, Paul, and George. Ringo didn't write any. He sang some, but he sang with help from my friends. But there was so much about that album that they didn't realize they were breaking norms. And it got to be that people sat down and just listened to it as if they were at a play.
My cat has decided to join the show as much as she can, and that's why I keep going over here and shooing her away as much as I can.
She's waiting for me to talk about "Leave My Kitten Alone," which was a song the Beatles recorded in 1964.
Ah, yes. Let's talk about some of the elements that are involved with the show Beatle Brunch.
Sure.
And by the way, for those of you out there that think it's easy to put these things together, it's not. As you progress forward and over the years, you add this, take away this, the audience likes this,
Sure.
we do this, we do that. I know that you did, you played mind games with people.
That's a little contest. We still do that at the end, and it's always something that you heard on the show. So it's, if you listen to the show and I said, oh, by the way, I'll be on with Gary Allen and the Mainstreet next week. And then at the end, I ask the question, hey, who did I say I'll be on with now? You know what I mean? So and then they can see the answers and pick the right one. So yeah, we do mind games. And it's gotten to the point where the record companies don't really have any prizes anymore. I have some things. So what I started doing is I can't take it with you, right? So I started giving away records and things that I have in my collection that fit the theme of the show. So like, for example, last week or a couple of days ago, we did a show about your road trip playlist. So you had songs like Drive My Car, Ticket to Ride, Day Tripper. Ringo did a song called In My Car. And so I gave away a copy of Band on the Run. That's kind of a traveling song. And it was the original promo copy 45, my own personal radio promo. So it has Band on the Run on both sides. Remember those, Gary? The promos?
Yeah, oh my God.
So the average person doesn't.
And there'd be one of the ears on the corners would be cut off.
Sometimes, or they would poke a hole in it. Actually, they would do that. But usually the radio promos didn't have a picture sleeve, but you got the record, and often it was stereo on one side and mono on the flip side. And then it would have like a little sticker that told you the intro time, 17 seconds or whatever. So I've been giving away my own personal property. I mean, it's going to be expensive to mail a mixing console eventually when I replace it with the new one. So
speaking of which, can you imagine if the Beatles had never? Well, there you go. You can talk about that, but can you imagine? I was thinking about this the other day. I was talking on the phone with a friend of mine in New York. Can you imagine if the Beatles had never gotten together?
Somebody started a link of that throughout. There's a bunch of us that chat on Sunday morning at 9 when you're in the Beatle Brunch Club. We have a community section. A bunch of us listen to the show through our computers or phones, and we chat about stuff. And one of our members brought up, what if the Beatles, George Martin had rejected them at the audition? And I actually said, what if they had passed the audition for Decca Records, because they failed that audition, and then Decca brought in the Rolling Stones, kind of like, haha, we're not going to make that mistake again. But they didn't pass the Decca audition. But what if they had? How different of a band would they have been? Because they wouldn't have had George Martin to produce them and play keyboards and rock and roll music. That's George Martin. Right. He played on like half of their songs. He plays keyboard and organ and those instruments, and he brought in the classical music. He knew how to score a symphony, score a string section for Yesterday and for Eleanor Rigby and all that whole side two of Abbey Road. Mm-hmm. So if they were just Decca, maybe they just would have been like a cover band, because at the Decca audition, they played mostly covers, Till There Was You and Money and the songs they
Yeah.
were playing at that time anyway. So
But
yeah,
I-
what
yeah,
if
yeah.
what if they you're right. What if there hadn't have been Beatles? What if they hadn't have gotten the
Yeah,
money?
and
I
the
don't know. I think
technology and the
yeah.
technology that came from it because of George.
Right. Well, and because of the engineer Jeff Emmerich, who they wanted a different bass sound or mic sound, so they rewired the speaker, and John sang through a Leslie speaker, and you get that "Run up a line in love, da, 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 it is not violent," from
Yeah,
Tomorrow Never Knows or I'm Only Sleeping. So he recorded his voice through a Leslie speaker, and you never would have had that if Jeff Emmerich didn't say, "Let's try this. It's a microphone in reverse. We'll plug it in over here." And he tested that. Or John would say, "I want to sound like I'm a Dalai Lama singing from the highest mountain," and then George
yeah.
had to figure out how to make that happen. So yeah, I mean, it would have been a lot different if they hadn't signed her. But I still think that the four personalities were very strong, still are. Paul and George, and Paul and Ringo and George and John's memory. They're very strong personalities, and they might have hooked up anyway because George and Paul were riding on the same bus to school every day.
Mhm.
Pete Best was the original drummer, and they used to go to his mom's house and use the phone, and she was kind of their booking person, and they rehearsed and played down in the cellar that they had in the house at the Best home, which is being restored as a bed and breakfast now. You're going to be able to stay where the Beatles played their first play.
Right.
The little club that they had there in out in the West Liverpool.
Talk
So
about
who
Pete
knows?
Best a minute. Talk about
Yeah,
Pete Best. A lot of people think. I found out that he eventually went to work for the London Transit Authority, I believe.
I think it might have been the water company, but maybe he was part of a metro thing,
Yeah, yeah.
But
And I know the Beatles shared with him some royalties because he was on some of the songs at the very, very beginning of the Beatles before Ringo came along. And I know
right.
they shared some money with him, but he went through some rough years. But he said he never had any really hostility or anything towards anybody. He may have been mad at one time, but he didn't hold on to that hostility for
Yeah.
very long, I guess.
I don't know. There were rumors that was considering committing suicide in the early 70s. I don't know. I've met him many times. He's a wonderful, sweet guy, and he's been on a couple of our Beatles tribute cruise things that we would do a couple of years ago, and a great guy. He was like I said, they practiced at his mother's house. They had a little club downstairs. She had a telephone, which was a rare situation in those days to have a phone. You could book yourself gigs at the different clubs around the Liverpool area or even further away. And they tell the story that they started to get dissatisfied with him because he had other commitments and he couldn't always show up. And they ended up, inviting Ringo to fill in once in a while. So they felt like, no matter what was happening with Pete, how great that was. The
Yeah.
minute that Ringo got there, it was like, oh, it's like when Coop and I met. That's the part that was missing, So, and that was what it was. But you're right. There were 11 songs on the Beatles anthology that featured Pete's drumming. So he was naturally entitled to that. And I heard it was in the millions of dollars, somewhere around 10 or 11 million. So if he was good with his money, he should have invested in Apple stock back in 1994.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Doesn't McCartney have that back now? Didn't he get the rights to the music back after Michael passed away?
What he did was he negotiated his own deal separately from the songs that Yoko owned as John Lennon's widow. So he negotiated his own deal, and he never came public with what the terms of it were. So he does re-own his half of those songs, and Yoko, I guess, owns the half of that were written by John. George's songs never fell in that category because he wasn't part of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting team. He was Harris Songs, and then his own music company. So Here Comes the Sun, and those songs were not part of that Michael Jackson thing. But George told a story that he was at a session with Michael Jackson, and Michael turned to George and said, "Aha, I'm going to own your songs one day," or something, because he thought he was buying something. And Here Comes the Sun, but in effect, he was actually buying the Lennon-McCartney stuff, which was over 200 songs, by the way.
Yeah, and I always thought George, people looked at Ringo and George like, what are you doing here? You're like background stuff. And the truth of the matter
Uh,
is, George was brilliant as a writer. Ringo, he just kind of went along for, you know,
yeah, but
his
I
input.
think you and I may have talked about this before. Think of the things that Ringo did by accident that became what we're used to hearing. A Hard Day's Night. They got out of the studio, filming all day, and he looked around and said, "Oh, that was been a hard day." And he looked around, it was dark, and he said, "Night. It's been a hard day's night." So there was a Tomorrow Never Knows was a Ringoism. Like
Mhm.
what are we doing later this week? Oh, tomorrow never knows. Whatever the question was. And there's
Good
a couple
impression.
more.
Good
Well,
impression.
hello, Joe. This is Ringo. Fabulous Ringo.
How
Um,
was it interviewing him, by the way?
it's two different interviews, Ringo and Paul, and they're both wonderful and sweet and very generous with their answers. But Ringo is always pushed for time. So the times I've interviewed Ringo, it's typically been under 10 minutes. The interview I did with Paul in 2015 in Tampa was like
Mhm.
23 minutes. It was just him and I, the photographer and the publicist and a videographer. Nobody else
Which
in the room.
almost didn't happen if I remember the story.
Yes, yes, because I had a mini disc. I have one on the shelf back here. I had a mini disc recorder. Let's see if I have a mini disc here somewhere.
We're watching Main Street. Gary Allen with you. My guest is Joe Johnson, the host, writer, creator of Beatle Brunch, which you can catch on many of the radio stations throughout the country. And if you want to watch it, it's brunchradio.com.
Yes.
And if you want to listen to this and listen to more of Joe Johnson, please go to
Yeah.
brunchradio.com. It's fantastic.
And a lot of the parts of the site are free. I have a section called Brunch Bites, and
Hmm.
somebody just sent me, one of our listeners that comes to the chat on Sunday morning, sent me this 45. It's from 1970, and it's Beatle interviews. And then if you read it,
Hmm.
it's put together by this church, some church, and so it's narrated by a pastor or someone. I haven't listened to it all the way through, but we converted it to MP3 and we put it in Brunch Bites, and we tell a little story about it, and we show a picture of the record, and then you can listen to the whole thing. It's
Right.
mainly recordings from around 1970 when they were breaking up. So that's on our site. If you go to brunchradio.com, you'll see a section called Media. And if you click on that and go to Brunch Bites, and also videos, those are just available for everybody. And there's a lot of stuff on there. There's singles, EPs, bonus tracks that weren't on albums. There's interviews. When it was Ringo's birthday, I put 4 interviews that I had done with him on there, and they're all like 10 minutes long. And not sure. I think the Paul McCartney interview is on there. I think I have it in 2 parts, but
Were
it's
they both
definitely on YouTube.
were they both fairly open with the questions you asked?
Well, the story is in truth, the McCartney publicist said to me, you got the interview. You can talk about anything. Don't talk about the Beatles. Don't talk about his kids. Don't talk about Linda. Don't talk about Heather. Don't talk
Huh.
about his family. Only talk about. Don't talk about Wings. Only talk about the show that's happening this week and the new album, Chaos and Creation of the Backyard. I said, fine. So I wrote up my questions, and my first question was, Paul, I saw you last night in Miami. In fact, he's going to be here tomorrow. He's going to be here at the Hard Rock Hollywood Wednesday, tomorrow, the 25th.
Oh,
So I asked him a question. I said, "Hey, I saw you last night at the American Airlines Arena, and you played for 2.5 hours." And he goes, "Well, in the Beatle days, we played 29 minutes if we liked you. If we didn't like you, we played 26 minutes." And so he started talking about the Beatles, like literally 1 minute into the interview that I was told, "Don't talk about the Beatles." So he told the story of how he wrote "Hey Jude," and he told other stories, and it was definitely the most memorable thing. And in fact, the show I'm working on now for this weekend, I'm going to put a clip of that, like when I first say hello to him and that kind
right.
of thing. And also, there's other stuff that I'm going to put this weekend. I was on the Today Show in 2004. They were doing a segment on the Beatles because it was the 40th anniversary.
Right.
78 or 94, 104. Yeah, it was his 40th anniversary of the Beatles coming to America. And Matt Lauer, can we say his name? Matt Lauer
Yeah.
was the host of the piece. And so they actually had a piece with me recorded here and at a couple of clubs we went to. And it was about cover bands. And I think the way that I ended it was like, the Beatles were the ultimate cover band. They started out doing all those cover songs. And so the whole focus of it. So anyway, on the show this weekend, I'm going to play a little section of me being interviewed on the Today Show, which is I've never played before. And then I'm going to post the video because it's never been posted on YouTube before. So
Oh, that's
I just
great.
happened to I found it last week on a video cassette. Remember those?
Oh yes, I always remember those, back in the day, it's really a beautiful thing,
Listen,
Remember
speaking of
you
cover,
had yeah.
what? Go ahead. Go
Good. I was
ahead.
gonna say it had to PAL or NASCA or whatever. Like there were two standards.
Yeah.
If you went to London on a trip and you brought back a video, it wouldn't play in your player here.
No,
Those
no,
no.
no, no, not at all. You just mentioned cover bands. Much like the Rat Pack and Marilyn Monroe and other things, there are cover bands, impersonators out there of the Beatles, probably left and right. I mean, when I lived in Las Vegas, I probably knew, not by name, but by sight, 300 or 400 Elvis impersonators of all
Sure.
sizes, all shapes, everything else. Have you run across one or two that you could talk about
Yeah. Oh,
that
that are
that come so
phenomenal.
close to the
Yeah.
Beatles?
Well, I'll tell you two of my favorites. Well, one is the band that we have on the 70s Rock and Romance Cruise and also on the Flower Power Cruise a lot, and also at Abbey Road on the River, which is this coming weekend in Jeffersonville, Indiana, is
Mm.
a band called the Jukebox, and they're from Puerto Rico. And they are fantastic, fantastic Beatles cover band. But they don't just play the 5 songs from Ed Sullivan Show. They play tracks from the White Album and Savoy Truffle and when they were on the 70s cruise, they did Wings and Paul McCartney and Wings and George Harrison, Ringo Starr, John Lennon's Instant Karma. They're a fantastic band and they're super nice guys. I work with them a lot on the cruise, but
Yeah.
also out of New York, the Fab Four, which is made up of Will Lee from all those years with the Letterman Show. And
Right.
if you pick up any album, almost, except for maybe something brand new, he plays bass on practically every session in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then in their band also is Jimmy Vivino. He's now with Canned Heat. He's took the place of the lead guitarist in Canned Heat. I just saw him on the
They're still
Flower
around?
Power. Yeah, I just saw them on the Flower Power Cruise. So Jimmy
Holy
Vivino
cow.
is also in the Fab Four, FAUX, and they're awesome. But since you were in Las Vegas, there was a band there called the Fab Four, the Ultimate Tribute, and they had residency at one of the hotels there. And I got to know them very well. We actually made a CD together, interview CD with some of their songs on it.
It's a good old thing,
I want to go back. I want to go back to the 1963, 1964 when I was a little fellow. And I
Mhm.
remember the Beatles first coming to this country and the uproar from the police and the FBI and you name it. And then, of course, a few years later, John made his wonderful statement that we're more popular than Jesus Christ, which that went over like a lead brick. But man, the British invasion was like suddenly the Germans were bombing New York. I mean, it was
Well,
not
yeah.
well received. I mean, the kids went crazy over it. The
Yeah,
women,
yeah.
they went crazy. But the adults thought, "Oh my God, this is the end of the earth. That's all humanity, and rightful things are going out the window. Look at how they have their crazy hair and all this other." I mean, God, I even said to my aunt, I said, "Calm down. They're just a rock and roll group. Who knows how long they'll last?" You know?
Well, I think one song that helped the Beatles on their first Ed Sullivan Show is when they did "Till There Was You." And so there's "Till There Was You," which was from the Music Man, as you know. And so our parents, my parents, or whoever's parents, or all the folks that are old enough to know that song at the time, were like, "Wow, the Beatles! I got to give these guys a listen. Listen how beautiful that guy's voice is." Turned out it was Paul McCartney. They
Yeah.
did "Till There Was You," and then in '65 they did "Yesterday" on the Ed Sullivan Show. So there was more to it than that. And if you look at their hair, it's probably about as long as mine is right now, maybe a little bit longer on the side by the ears, but their hair wasn't that
Mine,
long.
probably
Yeah,
mine.
yeah.
I mean, mine is. I need to get a haircut badly.
Which one are you thinking of cutting?
The one on the left. The
Okay,
one
yeah,
on the
that's what I was going to suggest. Well, it's my right, but yeah, that's the one.
Well,
But anyway,
well,
yeah, they when the British invasion happened, and I've actually done a show on it where we play only like one Beatles song, and we play like the "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and then it's all the British covers. The first, I'm going to give you a trivia question, Mr. Gary Allen of Mainstreet. Do you
well,
know
yeah.
who the do you know who the first woman to come over in the have a chart hit in the British invasion?
I
Do,
want to
do,
see
do,
Jewel Clark.
do, do. Petula Clark. That is not correct. Think of another. She was close. She would have been maybe second. I almost said you're
Oh,
correct, and then I started thinking about it. You don't have to say you love me. Just tell me what
she
song.
was
I
in a
think.
movie. She was in the movie To Sir with Love.
Well, you're thinking of Lulu.
Lulu.
No, that's not it. This one could use a dusting.
Oh, Dusty Springfield.
Yes.
Ooh, I didn't know she was British.
Oh yeah, Dusty Springfield.
Oh,
So she did "I Only Want to Be with You," I think was her first hit, and then she
yes, I
did
remember that.
"Wishin' and Hopin'" and a couple of other songs. And Dusty, I actually have a CD, Dusty in Memphis. That was, I guess, she recorded there. But yeah, Dusty was the one. But you had people always talk about the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. The Dave Clark Five actually appeared like 11 times on the Ed Sullivan Show. The Beatles only appeared live.
Yeah.
Three times live. Well, no, let's see. They did 3 times the first month, and then they did one show in 1965 out in.
It's like in Las Vegas. They have everybody has a tribute to Elvis. Okay.
Mhm.
He had a residency there at a couple of the hotels along the way, but all they did was name 3 streets after Frank, Dean, and Sammy, who performed in Las Vegas more often than I do have hair on my head. And I I had nothing against Elvis. I just didn't particularly care for his music
Well,
or
he was based out of what hotel in Las Vegas? I remember going to see when you're
hotel,
going
the
in.
Hilton, the
The
Hilton.
Hilton, yeah, and they had all this memorabilia you walk through, but it was like going into Disney World where you look at all the stuff as you're getting before you get to the ride. It
Oh
was
yeah.
like, yeah, they had like his belt buckle and his wallet and all these and cool gold records and things like that.
Yeah.
But there's also an Elvis movie coming out in a couple of weeks, and Tom Hanks is going to play Colonel Parker. And that was the strange thing about Elvis. He never toured outside the United States because Colonel Parker didn't have a visa or a passport. And he couldn't
And
leave the country.
and the Beatles quit touring because of the fact of screaming and yelling from the fans. They couldn't even hear themselves on stage. And I believe their last performance was in San Francisco.
Um,
And that's when
yes,
they said,
Candlestick
enough
Park.
is enough. Enough is
Candlestick
enough.
Park.
We're
Yeah.
studio work, and that's the end of it. And of course, their last time they performed together was on the rooftop in London
Right.
above the studios. I mean, it's just fantastic. We're talking to Joe Johnson, host, creator, writer of Beatle Brunch. Please catch it on brunchradio.com. If you don't
Thank
have
you.
it in your area, tell people how they can. If there's a program director out there that catches this at some
Yeah.
point,
Yeah.
how can they get a hold of it?
They can just contact me, beetlebrunchradio@gmail.com, or you can send me a note through the Beetle Brunch Facebook page. That's always a great way to get something. You just go to Facebook, Beetle Brunch Show, and you can post on there. We sometimes will ask a question like it's Mother's Day, and we might say, which Beatles song is the best Mother's Day song? Is it Let It Be? Is it Julia? That kind of thing. So, and they love to answer, and then sometimes they'll answer with a voice memo and put it in the little send to the host, and then I play it on the show. In fact,
Oh.
on the this show I've got coming up, there's some voice memos from listeners who were recalling like when they first heard Beetle Brunch in 1992.
Wow.
So that's the way to do it. But yeah, the Elvis, was interesting. I never saw Elvis in concert, but you can't see behind me, but up on the wall behind this poster are 2 tickets to a concert that he never got to go to because they were printed for a show that was going to happen after he passed away.
Wink
So,
Martindale, who's a friend of mine, was best friends with Elvis, and he didn't like the Beatles at all. I mean,
well,
he
he went to Nixon and kind of tattletaled on them, to try to get them in trouble.
and here's the odd part. Guess who was in the White House the day that happened?
Was you really? I
Me.
didn't really. How long were you president?
Well, let me just say this, my fellow Americans.
That was you?
No, I was in the Air Force at the time, and we were on our way to Miami Beach to take him down to see BB. We've got to go and visit with BB Rebozo.
BB Rebozo.
And and he had an appointment to come in and meet Nixon, and he wanted to spy on the show business community. And so Nixon gave him a plaque, and he had his little cape on, the white cape and the whole bit.
Yeah, I may have seen that picture. It's very
and when he left, I looked at the president because I was in the Air Force at the time, and I was waiting for him. I'm standing there with the secret code strapped to my wrist.
You had the nuclear codes that day?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
That was my job that day, and many others. And I said to him, "So what'd you think of Elvis?" He said, "It's a nut." He's nuts. He wants to spy on his own people. Come on, who would do that? And then, of course,
Oh,
years later, we had
yeah,
Watergate.
yeah. Years later, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That was
Um,
crazy.
Trivia question time for you, Mr. Joe Johnson.
Throw all you got at the screen.
What was the original name of the Beatles? Johnny and the Mondays, the Moondogs,
Moondogs.
the Blackjacks, or Iron
Oh,
Butterfly. And boy, when I saw Iron Butterfly, that brought back some memories for me. What was
yeah.
the original name for the
Uh,
Beatles?
what was the original? Well, I'm going to say Johnny and the Moondogs, but they also had the Nurk Twins. They also had the Silver Beatles. They also
Hmm.
had the Beat Brothers because they backed
Hmm.
up Tony Sheridan as the Beat Brothers. So quite a few names, but I would give it to the Johnny and the Moondogs, and I think that was very temporary. You know, it
The
was just something.
Blackjacks.
The Blackjacks is the one
Yep.
because it ended
Hmm.
up Pete Best ended up forming a band called the Blackjacks. So maybe Pete
Yeah.
took the name, and that was their parting gift to him.
Yeah. Who were the original members of the Beatles? Uh-huh.
Oh, that's harder because you're talking about when they were the Quarrymen, because
I
you have
believe you have Eric Griffin,
yeah,
Pete
Eric Griffith,
Schroeder,
I think. Yeah,
Griffith, Pete Shouter,
Pete Shotton.
Shotton, excuse me, Bill Smith, and John Lennon, or McCartney, Harris, Ringo, Lennon, or Norm Chapman, Stuart Sutcliffe, or John
Hmm.
Lennon.
Well, I think that John Lennon might have preceded all of them because
He
he
was, yeah.
was with his friend who got into that you mentioned, bass player at that time before Paul McCartney. He got into a fight. Somebody hit him over the head, and then they say it was a blood clot. You know, a couple of weeks later
Ooh.
that he died from that.
But it was Eric Griffith and Pete Schroeder, and Bill
Shotton.
Smith, Shotton, and John Lennon. They were the original Beatles.
Very nice. And I think maybe one of the Quarrymen is still with us. And he's actually written a part in a book by a friend of mine named Jim Birkenstad. It's the Mysteries, Rock and Roll Mysteries. There's a great section on Elvis. There's a great section on the Traveling Wilburys, and the Rock and Roll Detective put out a book that's pretty cool. You should have him on you.
Well, I'll get in touch with you. You get in touch. The
Sure.
4 earliest influences for the Beatles were Carl Perkins, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and was it Benny Goodman, Dean Martin, or Elvis Presley?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was Elvis.
You know what? It's funny too how Elvis inspired the Stones. The Stones used to go to Chicago. Of course, they were inspired by Muddy Waters and jazz and blues and stuff. But it is interesting how the American music really influenced part of the British invasion, because we discussed it the last time you were on the show, how the Beach Boys influenced the Beatles and how the Beatles influenced the Beach Boys.
Yeah, it was back and forth for a couple of 3 or 4 albums there, and they were huge fans. Paul McCartney says his favorite song is not "Don't Worry, Baby," but another one of the Brian Wilson from Pet Sounds. It's like amazing.
In My
Amazing
Room?
music. No, I'm gonna have to get that. I'll have to get back to you before the show is over. I think it was God Only Knows. It might be God Only Knows.
The one song that I really liked from the Beach Boys was the one that was in Good Morning Vietnam, but I've always enjoyed the song. But right now, the title, not In My Room, but it had that same kind of soft melody, whether on the beach and, oh Lord. Anyway.
We're getting old, Gary.
Yeah, we're getting old. Okay,
Yeah.
the Beatles recorded a total of blank songs: 305, 281, or 73. Well, 73 we know is out.
It wasn't 73. I'm going to say 305 because, I mean, are you counting the Beatles at the BBC? That was like another, 50.
No, that's the answer.
song.
305. Yeah, 305.
And I had a Chevy with a 305 in it, little V8, little small block V8.
She was that big, huh?
Yep, small block.
George Harrison, for a short time, was an apprentice working as a swordsmith, electrician, or farmer. He was an apprentice.
I'm going to say he was an electric's apprentice for electric.
Yes, electrician. Yeah. And we already talked about Pete Best, so we're not going to go through that territory again. By the way, I just want to thank the Miller Brothers for this program on the C News Network, as well as our community sponsors, the Japanese Garden and the Elks Club of South Florida.
Japanese Garden is just beautiful. We went on a field trip there when I was in like 5th grade.
Really?
It was on the not on the MacArthur Causeway there as you go
Yeah.
past, and then they had I grew up in South Florida, and you had the white
Mhm.
planes that would like chalks that would land right on the water there.
Yeah,
You
and
remember
I
that?
believe Chalks is no longer. Because I grew up in South Florida, my dad being based there with the airlines and all that stuff. If if the Beatles were alive, the four of them,
Yeah,
and we know how the Stones are selling out everywhere that they go.
right.
I asked Mick Jagger this question when they were here in Orlando about 5 to 7 years ago, and my buddy was in charge of security, and I got to work backstage. So I asked Mick Jagger this: that if the Beatles were alive, all four of them, and they decided to do a final farewell tour of the world, he said, "Oh, there's not." He said they could play in your Rose Bowl for 3 months and sell it out night after night after night
Well,
after
look at
night.
Billy Joel. He does a couple of shows a month at Madison Square Garden, sells out every one. He's been doing it for
Yeah,
like 5 years.
yeah. I mean, people say, "Oh, that music is dying out. That music is dying out." No,
Who are
it's
those
not.
people who say that? You get them over here. You line them up on this
It's
window
the
right
same
now.
people that say that, "Oh, Frank and Dean and Sammy, the music is passe." No, it's not. No, it's not. Good music is good music, and the Beatles were the inventors. They were the people that brought about so many changes, uh, so much i- that they brought that other groups eventually copied and did. And if it wasn't for George Martin and the creativity of the studio, brought about the technology that is utilized today, whether we realize it or not. It's like NASA. If it wasn't for NASA, we probably wouldn't have cell phones and some of the other technology that we have. Eventually, it might have come along, but the Beatles were inventive and inventors with the kind of stuff that they wanted to do. And George Martin would go crazy, going, "Oh, okay, we will do this over here and do that."
Yeah, but
So,
you got to remember, and John Lennon has said it in many interviews. Paul McCartney has said it in many interviews that
yeah,
they were just doing what they were imitating the heroes they love. That's why there's so many covers in the early days, and then there are a lot of songs that the Beatles wrote, and the one that comes to mind because it's been talked about the past year or so is "Come Together." He goes, "Here come old flat top, he come grooving up slowly." And if you listen to Chuck Berry's "You Can't Catch Me," here come old flat top, he come grooving up with me. He got rolling, it's the same riff. And Paul said when they were recording it, he said to John, you can't put that in there. That's the Chuck Berry song. But they left it in anyway. And then
yeah,
years later, John admitted it. And the owner of that music catalog, of the Chuck Berry music catalog, um, sued John Lennon, and he ended up having to record 3 of that label's songs on his rock and roll album. That was his penance for being a bad boy during Come Together.
and
But they
now it
did
would
that a
be.
couple of times.
Yeah, and now it would be millions and millions of dollars, and that he'd have to pay to him for all of that. And it's just unbelievable. What are your favorite albums? You could say all of them, but I'm sure that there's
Yeah,
one
yeah,
or
all of
two that
them's
stick
not the
out.
right answer. I mean, I do, it's funny because although I never really absorbed this as fact for myself, but there are people who grew up in America that said, "Meet the Beatles," and Beatles, uh, those albums, that the American versions of the ones that eventually came over this way. There was no Meet the Beatles in England. There was no Beatles 65. There was no Yesterday and Today. There was no Hey Jude album. But here we had them. It was a place to put more stuff that they didn't put on an album. The Beatles, up until a certain time, they would release a single. And, like, for
Hmm.
example, "I Feel Fine" and "We Can Work It Out." And they would not put those songs on an album because they felt you were being ripped off. If you had to buy the album and it had the single that you already bought, they thought that was ripping the fans off. So they would put those songs out separately. And when they got their record deal with Capitol in America, finally, Capitol said, "Well, we're going to take all those singles and we're going to put them on an album. And also, we're going to take 14 songs that you're putting on Beatles for Sale, and we're going to keep 2 of them and use them on Beatles 65, I'll Follow the Sun or No Reply,
Right,
whatever." So
right.
that's why there are 20. And John even said it in a famous New York interview. It seems we only did like sort of 10 albums in America. There seemed to be 20 of them. And then they put out the love songs, Capitol put that out, and the red and blue album versions with all the hits on it. And
Yeah,
so it was a different scene. And I think when when we got wind of what was going on in England, like later on in my 20s, more likely, where I had more spending power, I started buying the British versions of those
Right.
albums.
You
And
still
now
have
when,
them?
yeah, I do have them still. Yeah. And once they, once they realized that there was a market, they started releasing the British albums in America, when they wanted to put them out on CD, like 1987. And they were all in mono at the time. So they got better and they cleaned them up and they put them out in stereo and they remastered them. And now they're going back and doing the box sets like they did Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, Abbey Road, most recently Let It Be, and what was going to be the Get Back album.
Yeah.
So they've been, the Beatle people that put this stuff out, George Martin and the folks at Apple, have been pretty generous with what they put out. And when they did the White Album in 2018, the remix of the 50th anniversary, supposedly in the vaults, there's like a 29-minute version of Helter Skelter that just goes on into Revolution number 9. And people were very upset that they only put out like a 12-minute version of it. And Giles Martin said, well, I could either put out 29 minutes of that and I'd have to sacrifice 3 other songs on the album because, to fit that on, you can only fit, 79 minutes on a CD or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So, but they've been very generous with the bonus tracks and the early mixes and the alternate takes of Lucy in the Sky and some of the tracks that they put out. And so yeah, when we found out there were these other albums out there, I know for me to buy a British version of an album when I was a teenager or in my early 20s, instead of it being $4.99 at Specs or Peaches Records, it was like $20 to buy an import like that. So you take your chances and you buy 1 or 2. I couldn't certainly buy all 10.
And now today it's probably a couple $100.
Well, it depends, but and then there was a lot of bootlegs at the time. But the Beatles, August 4th, 1964, held the top 5 positions on the chart, number 1 through 5.
Wow.
And part of the reason is they were competing record labels. You had Capitol, you had EMI and the Beatles, you had Tolly, also that did Twist and Shout, and you had Parlophone, or there was one other label. So you had 4 labels putting out songs at the same time. They were competing because the Beatles tried to get an American record label and they kept getting turned down. So you had VJ. VJ was the one. And then people started bootlegging the VJ album. And there's the original's worth a lot of money, but the bootlegs, not so much.
What did you learn from Get Back, the rockumentary that you didn't know before?
Well, I will tell you that thanks to the pandemic, Peter Jackson, who was going to release a 90-minute version in the happy world where we were all busy, when he got locked down, he says, let me just keep going. He did over 6 hours. So watching all 6 hours gives you more of a balanced perspective because you have a lot to pick from there. If he only put out a 10-minute section, of course, he could put just the very best of, hey, Paul, you're the greatest writer in the world. Oh, John, I love you. Hey, aren't we happy? He could have done that, but instead he put out 6 hours. So what I learned, to answer your question, is that they seem to have a good time, down there in the studio in Twickenham, and then they shifted over to the home studio that they made at their Apple studios on Savile Row. I think the biggest thing I got is they really loved it. You see these great moments of John laughing, and when Paul is writing Get Back, he's just now starting. He's strumming actually on his bass. And he's playing the hey, JoJo was a man, and Ringo's hearing it and he's jumping on and George is jumping on, and you watch them create this song Get Back. But there's always been interviews where John Lennon said, oh, Get Back, it was miserable. I was miserable in Twickenham Studios and we were sleeping and we had to be there at 9:00 in the morning, and no one wants to do that. But you watch him and he seems to be having a great time. And at that time, a lot of people don't know or may not remember, right at the end of the beginning of 1969, or John had been in a terrible car accident with Yoko, Yoko's daughter Kyoko, and Julian. They were all in this accident together. He was going through a breakup. He was trying to form his own band, the Plastic Ono Band, so they could do these one-off concerts of charity. So, and he was not feeling well. And so to get him up at 7, 10, 9:00 in the morning in the studio and then have it look pretty great is a testament to what they did. But and I was mentioning Paul McCartney will be in Hollywood, Florida, our area here,
Mhm.
tomorrow night. And one of the highlights of the show, and it's kind of a spoiler, but it's been all over social media, so I can tell you, the first song in the encore, Peter Jackson texted. Paul tells the story. Peter Jackson texted him one day. He says, "Hey, Paul, I've got the isolated version of the single camera on John the whole time he's doing. You guys are doing I've Got a Feeling." And I've Got a Feeling is one verse John and one verse Paul, and then they sing on top of each other, different verses. It's definitely a 50-50 collaboration. So Peter Jackson provided the film, and it stays on John. And when Paul's singing, John's not singing. So you can see him look at the monitor, and all of a sudden the two guys are singing together after 50 something years again.
Yeah.
And they're
Yeah.
doing I've Got a Feeling. And everybody had a hard year. Everybody had a good time. Everybody pulled the socks up. Everybody let the sun shine. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And it's just such a great piece. And you can find it on Twitter, on social media, YouTube. It's pretty easy to find. People have been recording it. So if you're not going to see the show tomorrow, or you maybe not going to see it, check it out, because I think it really proves that they had a chemistry and they enjoyed it. And, John wouldn't have put up with Paul if he had been writing crappy songs, and
No.
neither of them would have put up with the others,
As you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, that creativity doesn't come from anger, and it doesn't come from being ticked off at somebody else. It
Right.
comes from coming together.
And familiarity. And John out and out chose Paul as his partner. And he even says in one of his last interviews, there's only two people I ever chose to be my actual partner. That's Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono. He met Paul at that little church fete in 1957. And right at the meeting backstage, he said, "Hey, you want to be in the band?" And then Paul had to think it over and get permission from his parents, and that kind of thing, because he was only like 15. But they wouldn't have done that if he didn't have a recognition that he was going to be something special.
I want to dispel something that's been dispelled many, many times.
You're going to spell? Are we having a spelling bee?
No, not me. Not with my dyslexia.
We're going to have a dispelling bee.
We're going to dispel this. It was really George that turned to them and said, "I'm ready to move on without you. This has nothing to do with Yoko." And
Right.
This is me saying it. He didn't say it, because Yoko has been blamed for a lot of things. Yeah, she's probably not the nicest human being in the world, I'm told by some people.
Well, she was protecting her man. She was protecting her husband. Yeah.
But she also was kind of, anyway. But it was George who came to them first and said, "I'm ready to move on. I'm moving in new directions. I'm growing. I'm becoming someone else, and I really think it's time." And they both, the three of them, turned around. According to what Ringo, I recently saw an interview, and he said, "Yeah, it was time for us to move on. We were together for a very long time, which we didn't anticipate we were going to be together that long." Because most groups separate. The Beach Boys stayed together because basically those guys were related to one another. They were cousins.
But then they broke off. There's two or three Beach Boys bands with different members. Brian Wills has his own. But you talk about that when he quit. That's actually, you can see that in the Get Back series that's Peter Jackson put out. I forget exactly where, but it happens around January 10th. You see George there, and he's getting direction from Paul, and you can see he's getting a little cheesed off, and he's trying to suggest, and Paul's saying, "Well, I don't want to do that," and then so George stands up. He goes, "I'm going to be leaving the band," and John said, "When?" He goes, "Now," and he actually unplugs and he leaves the band. You see him walk off the set, or you hear him, and then that's where Billy Preston was there, and then you hear Paul say, "But you want a session job?" And that's how it came about. But you can see it in the film.
And because everything that they created from day one to when George walked out that day, if they weren't in sync with one another, and if they didn't love each other at some point like brothers, none of this would have ever worked. None of it could have ever worked. They were in sync. You just mentioned that Paul playing his bass, putting something together, and then suddenly Ringo steps in, John steps in, George steps in. If they weren't in sync, if they didn't love each other as brothers and in tune with one another musically, it wouldn't work. It's like a marriage. It either works or it doesn't.
And like a marriage, you have your little times where you need your space, whatever.
Listen,
Go for a ride, do something.
as loving and as wonderful as you and Coop are, and you're the perfect couple, I'm sure there are moments when Coop says, I'm going to go away from Joe
It's usually the opposite. She doesn't like to leave the house, so I'm usually the one that goes for a ride.
But I mean, it's like anything else in life. It has its ups and downs. And eventually George just said, and you could see it in George after he left, where he went out here, and he was even more creative than people would actually give him credit for.
I mean, the big thing is, as soon as he left the Beatles, he started recording All Things Must Pass, and it became a 3-album set, 30 more songs. And a lot of those were songs they rehearsed during that Let It Be period in January of '69 that the Beatles dismissed. All Things Must Pass and Isn't It a Pity? And there's other songs from that album that Paul and John just dismissed. And that's part of the reason. And he went and did his own thing.
Hey, we've run out of time.
What? Can we? How do we get more time?
We get you back, hopefully with Mindy Lang. That's for sure. If we can get Mindy in here, because God, she was wonderful to me when I was over at Waxy, and you guys were always great. And we have spent an hour talking to the fabulous and wonderful Joe Johnson, host, writer, creative genius behind Beatle Brunch. Please check him out at brunchradio.com. And listen
Join
to
the Beatle Brunch Club. You get to hear all the songs, all the shows with bonus content. It's like $2 a month. It's like crazy. It's just to keep the site up, but that's all we charge for. Nobody's getting rich here.
Next week, we're going to have Ron McGill on from Zoo Miami. We're going to talk about everything to do with animals.
Ask him about Beatles.
I will.
B-E-E, no B-E-E-T-L-E-S. He can talk about those kind.
Oh, the Beatles.
Talk about those kind of Beatles. Ask him about bird. You could do a whole rock show with him just talking about birds, B-Y-R-D-S.
Oh, I have so many things to talk to him about. The crazy gator that he is. I want to thank my executive producer, Rick Del Vecchio, my studio producer, Andres, our community sponsors, the Japanese Garden and the Elks Club, Elks Lodges of South Florida, as well as Michael and Grant Miller for giving us the platform here on the Community News Network. I want to thank them very much. I want to thank Joe Johnson very, very much. One of these days, Coop is going to come on this show. I swear to you, we're going to have to hog tie her to do it at least 3 or 4 hours ahead of time, but she's going to come on here one of these days.
There are people who think she doesn't exist and that I only get clips I pull down from photos that I have license to.
No, she exists very much so. She exists very much
so. She does a lot of dancing for me on little videos when we go to the restaurants. She'll dance.
She's a wonderful person. I can't wait to come home because being with you two guys is always a gas. Joe, thank you so very much.
Thanks for letting me run over into the next guy's time. I appreciate that.
He'll wait a couple of minutes. And I want to thank all of you out there for joining us here on Main Street. This is Gary Allen. Until next week at 2 p.m. right here on the Community News Network, where we're going to have a great guest, Ron McGill from Zoo Miami. Take care of yourselves and each other.
The end.